Okay, this is Chapter 8, Labeling Theory. And labeling theory is a theory that was very prominent in the 1950s and 60s. Its roots may go clear back to the 30s, but certainly during that time of social unrest and people questioning the government and kind of responding to big money. And what it represents is a shift from actual focus on the actor to the reaction to the act. So it's basically saying nothing is delinquent, deviant, or criminal by itself. It is only criminal because we react to it as such. And in some of those cases, people may not even know that a delinquent act occurred or why it did, but the focus is on how people responded and put the label on it, whether it's deviant, criminal, or delinquent. So one of the big criticisms historically is that labeling is not concerned about motivation. They're not concerned with why. All right. The social and intellectual heritage of labeling. In the social events, 50s and 60s, a lot going on. A mistrust of government. People wore buttons that said question authority during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations in the 60s. They had the Great Society programs. And of course, you had the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Movement, the protests against the Vietnam War. There were school desegregation. There was a lot of things about inequality, and certainly urban riots, Watts, Newark, places like that. The intellectual heritage, most of it goes back to the University of Chicago, the Chicago School. In this case, probably more on symbolic interaction than anything else. Also at that time, and we talked about this in Chapter 7 as well, a critique of official statistics. People began to realize that a lot of crime went unreported, so there was a bias in official statistics. And the greater reliance on self-report studies or self-report methodology, where people were asked the kind of behaviors they engaged in rather than looking at arrest reports or prison reports or juvenile institution reports. Okay. The self-report studies and how they affected labeling. The two big name people that tackled this were James Short and Nye, 57, 58, latter part of the 1950s. And what they did was made a comparison between juveniles that were officially delinquent in institution and juveniles who were not officially delinquent or non-delinquents in school systems. And they asked them a series of behaviors and whether or not they had engaged in them. That's why we call it self-report. And what they found was quite different from what official statistics showed us, because official statistics showed us at that time delinquency was a product of race and social class. And now, after Short and Nye started using the self-report, when we looked at delinquent behaviors, the things that would take you to juvenile court, that could take you to the juvenile court, there was a much smaller relationship between race and class. So that created the question is, why does the UCR show all of that bias towards the lower class? Some basic assumptions that go along with the labeling perspective. Criminals do not exist in nature. Criminals do not exist per se. They are created because we have laws. And laws are made in a social and political process, so they are relative. We don't have all the same laws as they have in Russia, Mexico, Afghanistan, China, Brazil, and vice versa. And of course, over time, things that were crimes in the United States back in the 1800s may not be today, and of course we have new behaviors that are criminal that didn't even exist back then. So the focus for the labelists, instead of being on the criminal, is on the societal reaction, not the crime itself, or not the offender, the criminal offender. Now, the labelists take a broader perspective or broader scope and look at deviance as well as delinquency and crime, simply because only some acts get labeled as crimes, but they still may be deviant. The labelist really focused on the stigma that came along with different labels and on the audience behavior, the general public, how they react to that. So, imagine if, for you young ladies, if you come home and said, "Dad, I'm dating a sex offender who just got out of prison," there's a stigma of that all the way, and we probably can't repeat what most parents would say in those situations. All right. One of the earlier authors in the 60s was Howard Becker, University of Northwestern University, just outside of Chicago. Those are his two books. Of the two, The Outsiders is probably his more famous. And again, outside the normal circle of friends or members. Because if you are deviant, delinquent, or criminal, you're not a desirable friend. You're on the outside. Okay. Becker was concerned about who has the ability to make and enforce the rules, and basically found that it was through the process of power that people with power have that ability or that potential. He referred to these people as moral entrepreneurs. They want to define morality because they have a vested interest in the rules. They want those things that are sacred to them to be protected, and they want those things that are a threat to their morality to be deemed crimes. And Becker identified two different roles in there. Rule creators, the people that make the rules. Some of them are crusaders, some of them are moralists. They're both reformers, and they're upset by anything that challenges or disturbs what they think is morally right and good. And so they're concerned with the end product, and usually at whatever cost. Rule enforcers don't necessarily have a stake in the content of the rules, but want to justify existence and more power. They exercise discretion, and they want more resources. One of the things you find is the way to get resources is to have a problem. So the broader the net, the more things are defined as criminal, deviant, or delinquent, the more apt you are to get resources to combat those things. So, again, take specific notice of the word discretion. It's a term that really is paramount to understanding labeling. There's a lot of selectivity on who gets arrested and who doesn't, who gets prosecuted and who doesn't, who gets probation and who gets 4 years, who gets life without parole, and who gets the death penalty. All those are discretionary decisions. We're going to define discretion as simply between a choice between two or more courses of action. So that choice between a speeding ticket or a warning, that choice between being prosecuted for a crime versus being diverted to alcohol treatment, that choice between probation and restitution, or 5 years and or 20 years. There's a lot of range in penalties. So, again, for the rule enforcers, a lot of old agencies, particularly the police, get overburdened. They're expected to do more and more and more all the time, oftentimes without additional resources. Sometimes we create new agencies, and as the slide adequately depicts, Homeland Security, TSA, and you could look at the EPA, you could look at OSHA. You know, as we create more laws, we have to create more agencies to enforce those. And of course, again, that concept of discretion comes back to haunt us. If you allow for discretion, it paves the way for selective enforcement. All right. One of Becker's other contributions was by looking at the outcomes of labeling, and that's what these 4 things are. You know, and sometimes they use different terms, but either one of these, I'll give you the other terms sometimes. So a person who is obedient, they are obeying the law, and is perceived to be deviant or delinquent or criminal, is falsely accused. I think in some categories they're called wrongly accused. The second outcome is when someone who breaks the rules and is perceived to be deviant is the pure deviant, or sometimes the true deviant. Third outcome, someone who is not perceived as deviant and they are actually obedient, is conforming or conformist or truly innocent. And the fourth and last is a person who is not perceived to be deviant but is actually engaging in rule-breaking behavior. And those are the secret deviants, or sometimes called hidden deviants. So you can see, you know, on probability, we're only going to get it right about half the time. All right, at the very beginning of this chapter, we talk about the idea of societal reaction and versus secondary deviance. Those are 2 different approaches to labeling. And the societal reaction focuses on those 3 things. How the labels are applied, that's a process thing. Who the labels are applied to, that may be a conflict thing, certainly a power thing. And 3, how labels affect opportunities for those labeled, which is more of a consequence thing. In the newer edition, secondary deviance looks at what that label means to the person who's labeled. Does it change their self-identity? And how labels create further deviant behavior. If you are labeled a criminal, are you forced to interact with other criminals? Are you cut off from interacting with mainstream or law-abiding society? All right, so the big difference between the 2 is focus. Societal reaction attempts to explain how and why people react to others. So labeling is the dependent or the effect. How and why. And the consequence is the label. In the secondary deviance, they try to explain how a label causes more deviance. Labeling is the independent. By being labeled delinquent, are you cut off from the quote-unquote good kids and therefore tempted more because you have to run around with other delinquent kids? In the societal reaction focus, there's a de-emphasis on the criminal or the offender, and an increased focus on the agencies of the criminal justice process, police, courts, corrections particularly, but also society as well in some of those cases. The societal reaction focus alerts us to the subjectivity of the label. Not everyone who engages in illegal or unacceptable behavior is labeled deviant, delinquent, or criminal. And part of this comes from the middle class values. Our laws are a reflection of middle to upper class values. And of course, the people in this camp realize that by labeling delinquents, you give people a stigma, and that stigma has negative consequences down the road or in the future. Okay, competing values. All right, we are a pluralistic society. We saw that 2 weeks ago when we covered Chapter 7 with all the different subgroups and subcultures, which means that different people's values will be in conflict or in competition with others. And again, the difference from enemy, where there was one acceptable value system, doesn't apply here. And again, when a crime or delinquent act or deviant act occurs, some people it's not observed. So there's no way they're probably going to get caught. Others, even if it is observed or comes to attention, may not be processed for whatever reason. And again, others may be found innocent, they may be diverted and not get labeled. So one of the things about societal reaction is that recognition that certain criminals, certain deviants and delinquents are uncaught and undetected. So for them, labeling depends on, number one, only those that get caught. Criminal justice, or the definitions of crime, are enforced by the CJ system. But you have to be in police custody to do that. And the factors that affect the reaction is when it occurred, and we're not talking midnight versus noon. We're talking about the time period or the era. There's always a social and political context in society's perceptions of consequences, like drinking and driving. So if you were, at your age, arrested for drunk driving, and you got to choose your jury, who would you put on it? You would want probably other young people and other people who drink, because they're the ones most likely to have driven after drinking and not been in an accident or anything. So they won't think it's as bad. You want someone with that perception. The other side of that is the prosecutor, who's trying to gain a conviction, wants people who don't drink, have an aversion to alcohol, think it's the evil of all evils, and maybe even better yet, for their case, is to get jurors who lost someone close to them in a drunk driving accident.